Thank you for being here. Our website is on the screen now, so it's paclosangeles.com. And please go to our website and check us out and sign up for our mailing list. We have all kinds of, we're very busy. We have lots of talks and lots of interesting conversations going on while we're all here in quarantine. So join us on Zoom regularly. So please sign up so you can hear all about what's happening. Okay. What else do I need to say? Oh, in the chat, I have put I will put a link to Arcana Books for Dr. Rebecca Senf's book on Ansel Adams. It would be nice of us, if you're interested in buying the book, you can support your local bookseller here, Arcana, and the link is in the chat. You can find it there. So I think with that said, I'm going to go away and turn it over to our dear board president, Michael Hawley, who will say a couple words and introduce Dr. Senf. Thanks so much.
And Paula, when
Yes.
I'm finished, can I disappear as well? And so it's just Becky on the screen?
Yes, you'll just do your stop video.
Oh, I just do stop video. Great,
yes.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
So hi everybody, I'm Michael Hawley. I'm the president of PAC LA. And here we have the wonderful Rebecca Senf, who's we call Becky, and is just a great person. She and I run into each other all the time at fairs all over the place. And you know, I'm looking at photographs and there's, with one eye, I'm looking, where's Becky? Where's Becky? And I'm always so pleased to run into her, and we've become friends over the years. And she has this deep river of knowledge about photography. She's the chief curator at the Center for Creative Photography in Arizona. And PAC actually sponsors a fellowship at the CCP that Becky is very familiar with. And it's been one of our ongoing sponsorships, which I'm very proud of. And just a little side note, a group of us from PAC went to visit San Francisco. We went to SF MoMA, and the young woman who was showing us their private collection said, "Oh, I was the first recipient of this fellowship from PAC at the CCP." And we all just flipped, and it was fantastic. But anyway, that said, I'm going to turn it over to Becky. As I said, she's the chief curator of the CCP. She has her BA in art history from University of Arizona, and a master's and PhD from Boston University, and is the author of several books, including the one she's going to talk about today, Making a Photograph, the Early Works of Ansel Adams. And it's a fantastic book. As Paula said, we have a link to Arcana Books, which is a friend of PAC that is selling. It's a fantastic bookstore if you haven't been there in Culver City. And they're selling the book there for us. And we have a link that you can buy it directly. So I'm going to turn it over to Becky. And thanks, Becky. Welcome.
Thank you. I want you to do all my introductions. That was so nice. All right, so I'm going to share my screen so that we can look at the PowerPoint that I've put together. And today I'm going to talk about Ansel Adams and California in particular as it relates to his early work. Because my book is, oh, that didn't work. Let's see. There we go. My book is actually focused on Ansel Adams's early work. And so I'm going to draw a thread through the book as it relates to California in particular. And the book was released in February 18th of this year, right before we all got stay-at-home orders and the world changed so very dramatically. But this book is actually the product of many years of research. It began when I was hired at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, where I was in graduate school, to work on an Ansel Adams exhibition with Karen Haas. And so I researched for that exhibition, which opened in 2005. I was actually hired and began work at the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson in April of 2007, and then submitted my dissertation in December of 2007. And then in the years since then, I've had the pleasure of curating many Ansel Adams shows, both large and small, and then wanted to revise the dissertation as a book, but really was only able to do that once Anne Breckenridge-Barrett, the new director at the Center for Creative Photography, started in January of 2018. And at that point, I was really able to focus on rewriting it and getting it ready for publication. And then it was co-published by Yale University Press and the Center for Creative Photography. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And at the end, there'll be time for questions, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you all about the book or about Adams. So the basic question and premise of the book is, how does Ansel Adams go from making pictures like the one we see here on the left, which he made around 1920 in Yosemite Valley? How does he go from that kind of work, these small, low contrast, very intimate scenes, to works like the one on the right, which is from 1958, Aspens, northern New Mexico, which is more typical of what we would consider his mature work that we're used to associating with Ansel Adams. So my task with the book was to figure out how he goes from one to the other, what things we see in his early work that help explain that transition in the style of his work from one to the other. So we actually begin with Ansel Adams in Yosemite Valley as a 14-year-old boy. The year is 1916, and he's there with his family on vacation, like a pretty typical tourist. He goes and is given a box Brownie camera, just a very simple camera, which he makes photographs during his trip, and afterwards assembles them into an album. And what we're seeing here is one of the pages of that album. We actually have this album at the Center for Creative Photography. It's part of the Ansel Adams archive. And it's a wonderful way to see him starting out his photographic career. These were all developed at the photo finishing place in Yosemite Valley. So they're just little commercial snapshots. But what's so wonderful about them is we can already see Ansel Adams experimenting with photography. So there are actually 2 pages of half-dome pictures in the album. There's this page and this page, and I'm going to go back. So we can see him playing with composition. We can see him playing with lighting. You'll notice that Half Dome moves around the frame as he experiments with different kinds of framing and composition. So in the picture in the upper right corner, Half Dome's all the way to the left, whereas in the picture in the upper left corner, Half Dome's all the way to the right. In the middle, he's positioned Half Dome more at the middle, at creating a horizon line with backlighting. And then in the pictures on the next page of the album, he's experimenting with putting different kinds of things in the foreground. So you see tents in the foreground, or the Merced River in the foreground, or trees, or in the upper right, maybe it's somebody's sleeve. I'm not sure that that was intentional, but you can see that he understands that there are choices to be made, and that those are the things that he's trying to consider and manipulate as he makes photographs. So this is him just at the very beginning. And along with this album, we have wonderful documents like this letter that he wrote home to his Aunt Mary. She's the one who gave him a copy of the Hutchings book about Yosemite that inspired the trip. And so here Adams is writing back home to her, and I'm going to just read you the letter. I'm going to start with that second paragraph that says, "A couple of days ago. A couple of days ago, we went to Mirror Lake to see the sunrise. We then took the North Dome Trail up the Tenaya Canyon. It is a 21-mile trail, and we had the pleasure of walking about 1/4 of it. About 4 or 5 days ago, I went to the top of Yosemite Falls and Yosemite Point. I came back on fast time, covering 5 miles in 1 hour and 5 minutes. I have taken more than 85 good pictures. I have learned to swim and play pool and croquet. We expect to go to Glacier Point on Wednesday, either by the 11-mile trail or the Ledge Trail. We will go on the former on horses. Hoping that you are well and expecting to hear from you soon, I am Ansel Adams." So we get a sense of the things that the young Adams values at this point. He's learning all kinds of things. He's covering loads of territory in his hiking, and he's beginning to make pictures. But at this early point, the way that he tallies the quality is really about the number, 85 good pictures. So what happens then in the first chapter is an expansion of his engagement with hiking and mountaineering and with photography. This is a picture also from the archive, a portrait of Adams. I love this. You see him with his pack. His camera is set up on the tripod. I always imagine that he's looking at a map, but he may be reading something else. I'm not sure. But he is increasingly exposed to new ways of thinking about the landscape, and his mountaineering and photography develop together. And so I'd like to read another little passage that talks about this idea. Over the period in which Adams's photographic sophistication grew, his relationship with the natural world became more nuanced. The latter was a direct result of his personal relationships with fellow hikers. His growing friendships with various camping companions provided him the opportunity to share his outdoor experiences with seasoned naturalists. From his companions on the trail, he learned to enjoy the wilderness through a careful and methodical examination of the botany, zoology, and geology of the terrain. From the introverted boy whose close relationship to his parents provided him company and attention, he grew into a gregarious and outgoing young man, guided literally and emotionally by his new friends and mentors. Adams wove his photographic practice into these various outings, bringing his camera along and simultaneously building his artistic repertoire. The threads of Adams's social development, his growth as a mountaineer, and his evolution as a photographer were closely interwoven. The aesthetic and spiritual benefits of Adams's high country experiences are so closely bound they are hard to separate. Adams credits his first piano teacher, Marie Butler, with introducing him to the idea of self-expression through art. He began lessons at the age of 12, and Miss Butler not only tamed his distracted nature with her patient but rigorous expectations for the boy, but encouraged him to think about his playing in terms of thought, emotions, and feelings. From childhood, he learned to associate the arts with expression of one's interior life. His youthful connection to music became so all-encompassing that it might have become his profession, if not for the introduction of the even more consuming passions of photography and the wilderness. Viewing the landscape as scenery to be appreciated for its aesthetic qualities is for many hikers an integral and even spiritual part of the hiking experience. Adams describes such a transcendent experience from a high country trip with the Sierra Club in 1923. This is a quote, "The days of dusty toil, the weary miles of laborious climbing and descent, the obstinate resistance of 2 opinionated burros, the rising before dawn, and the camp founding after dark. After 5 days, I was tired, dirty, footsore, and thoroughly disgusted, in spite of the thrilling beauty of the ever-changing environment. However, on the 6th day, our march was short and early camp was made. I retired to my blankets in a stupor. I awakened, opening my eyes on a gigantic glittering dome of stars. The galaxy, a vaporous plume of white fire, poured down the southern sky, extinguished by the black, incisive spires of the forest. The stars loomed with terrifying brilliance. The darkness beyond them throbbed with unseen light. A cold wind passed between me and the remote splendor of the night, drawing sound after it through the groves of evergreen and aspen. The wordless meaning trembled on the mind's edge and passed on, while with almost hypnotic persistence, I watched the stars slowly stream over the earth. A short spell of sleep, and the white tower of dawn had reared out of the east. I walked toward the knife-sharp forest with the cold burning of the morning star glinting above me. I thought, as I plowed through the dew-dampened grass, that there could be nothing so complete in its glassy splendor as the sequence of starlight and dawnlight, with the crystalline, chaotic murmur of the stream and the hollow movement of the wind. There was no sentimental precedent. There was no imaginative experience with which to compare this magic actuality. My reactions spared neither my emotions nor my body. I dreamed that for a moment time stood quietly, and the vision of the actuality became but the shadow of an infinitely greater world that I had within the grasp of consciousness, a transcendental experience. Particularly meaningful here is the way Adams describes the interrelation of the physical, the beautiful, and the spiritual. He evokes images in the reader's mind, communicating the rapture of these events in vividly visual terms. The visual, however, did not exist in a vacuum. He remembered physical sensations and sounds as part of these moments of transcendental awareness. How often he achieved this degree of intuitive perception, one can only speculate. But certainly he sought both heightened awareness and an aesthetic experience every time he took to the wilderness with his camera. As a photographer, he must have seen the possibility for increased clarity of vision as an urgent motivating force for hiking in the High Sierra. So that gives you a sense of the way in which his photography and his experience of the wilderness are weaving together. So the next chapter of the book is about the Parmelian prints of the High Sierras, which is a portfolio he did in 1927. It was sponsored by a patron, Albert Bender, who provided the money to create the portfolio and then helped Adams find other patrons who would purchase copies of the portfolio. And so what you're seeing here is one of the prints from the portfolio, loose, and the colophon on the right-hand side. And you can see that the paper Adams used for this portfolio is translucent. So when it's lifted, it actually allows light to pass through the paper and illuminate the image, which is quite beautiful, a pretty interesting choice for Adams. And then this image is called Kearsarge Pinnacles. And then here it is just as a digital image. So Adams created this portfolio with Bender's encouragement, but he wasn't yet thinking of himself as an artist, and he didn't yet have a very clear sense of who his audience might be or what they might be looking for. So instead, Adams uses images that he already has. He makes some additional images, but the idea is that he's drawing on the body of work that he's most comfortable with, which are these mountain pictures in the High Sierra. And my thesis in the book is that Adams is essentially giving us a tourist, a backpacker, a hiker's perspective of this High Sierra terrain. And I group in the chapter, I group the pictures into different categories of hiking pictures. And I'd like to show you this picture of Marion Lake. And Marion Lake had very special significance to Adams. And I have a short passage that describes what Marion Lake meant to him. And in the book, I call this kind of picture a view from the trail. So, and I differentiate that from pictures, say, of campsites or pictures of close-up natural features. But this is an example of a view from the trail. Adams made another view from the trail, Marion Lake, which we're seeing here, on one of his trips with the LeConte family in the summer of either 1925 or 1926. Marion Lake was a place of special significance to him and of even greater significance to his mentor and hiking companion, Joseph N. LeConte. In 1902, LeConte named the glassy mountain lake for his wife, Helen Marion Gompertz LeConte, herself an avid hiker and climber.
In LeConte's diary from the summer of 1925, the year his wife died, the July 25th entry at Marion Lake reads, quote, "Got up late, and after a good breakfast, I went around on the west side of the lake and found a beautiful white granite rock bedded in the meadow near the shore of the lake. At the foot of this, Helen, his daughter, Joseph, his son, and I buried the box containing the ashes of my beloved wife. I then drilled the rock and started work on placing the bronze tablet. In the afternoon, I finished the erection of the tablet and with Ansel's help, placed a flat boulder over the grave," end quote. Adams must have felt honored to be included on such a meaningful camping trip. In Parmelian Prince, he included 2 views of this place to which he had a personal connection: Marion Lake from high up looking down at the glassy lake, and Cloud and Mountain at the portfolio's final photograph, also made at Marion Lake. So, of course, the Sierra Club plays a really important role in Adams's career and in his connection to California. He actually joined the Sierra Club in the 19-teens when he was a teenager, and he did this so that he could apply for a job as the custodian at the LeConte Lodge, which was a headquarters for the Sierra Club right in Yosemite Valley. And those of you who've been to Yosemite have seen probably the LeConte Lodge. So this job at the LeConte Lodge as custodian allowed Adams to spend an extended time in the valley over the summer without his parents having to pay for room and board. And that then gave him the latitude to do excursions in the High Sierra and to really spend a lot of time getting to know this landscape. So he began as the custodian. That then progressed to his submitting pictures like this one to the Sierra Club Bulletin. He had a number of images included. He also wrote articles and book reviews for the Sierra Club Bulletin in those early years. He went on to have a role on the Sierra Club Executive Committee on the board. And then eventually he became the official photographer for the summer outings for the Sierra Club. And in my book, I actually focus on the first year that he was the official photographer, which was 1928. And in that year, the Sierra Club did their summer outing to the Canadian Rockies. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on what he does with the Sierra Club outings in California. And it's important to back up a little bit and talk about the Sierra Club. So we tend to think of the Sierra Club as a political action committee that lobbies Congress on environmental issues, as a huge international membership group. But the Sierra Club actually began as a hiking club in the early 20th century. It was the Sierra Club, the club of the hikers who hiked in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And early on, they began this tradition of doing an outing, which was a summer trip that allowed the members to socialize and get to know one another, and to have a real grassroots experience of being in the mountains. And this was something that John Muir advocated, believing that if people experience the wilderness firsthand, they would build a connection to it, and then they would become advocates for its protection. So what we're seeing here is an image by Joseph N. LeConte that he made at the 1902 summer outing. And I just love seeing this picture of people at mealtime with the women in their long skirts. They actually had a commissary that cooked evening meals, and they would pack these Klondike stoves by mule into the wilderness so that they could cook a hot meal for the campers each evening. And then one of Adams's favorite parts were the kinds of entertainment that happened around the campfire. And this picture is from the 1931 outing. And we're seeing Adams He's the one kneeling in the front with the light sheet draped over him and a bent wood lyre. And I'm going to read you a little bit about this particular picture. And this is going to give a little flavor, a little history of what those early Sierra Club outings were like. Adams particularly valued the outing's educational opportunities. He savored the chance to hear college professors give astronomy lectures under the stars, or learn from leading geologists about current scientific theories. In addition to the edification, he heartily embraced the camaraderie and humor that became mainstays of the annual high trip. The key feature of the outing's social environment was the campfire, which Colby identified early on as crucial. Quote, "The evening campfire will be one of the attractions of the trip. Around it, the members of the party will gather to listen to lectures, stories, talks, music, singing, and to recount the experiences of the day and plan for the morrow." End quote. Adams described the campfire, the heart of outing life around which the communal spirit was forged, thus, quote, "As the cool wings of night fold on the mountains, the campfire eats ravenously into the dark, and you come with the others to sit on log or rock or stretch out on the earth and give happy attention to the affairs of the clan," end quote. In the outing's early decades, when wood was plentiful in the Sierra Nevada, the party built 2 large fires each evening after dinner, creating a stage area between them. Various outing members amused campers there with a nightly show while the commissary crew cleaned up. Adams's friend Cedric Wright played the violin, often accompanied by a student or perhaps by Adams's wife Virginia, who was known to have a beautiful singing voice. Campers also partook in less formal singing. In some years, campfire songbooks were printed, including standards such as Home on the Range and spoofs of period tunes such as Sunburn, sung to the tune of When You Wore a Tulip. Imagine in the flickering light and drifting smoke of the fire, the merriment of more than 100 campers' voices joining to sing, "When I wore a sunburn, a great big red sunburn, and you wore a soft silk shirt. When you would caress me, I hollered, 'Oh, bless me, you've no idea how it hurt.' Of sunburns I'm weary, of blisters I'm leery, the skin's peeling off my nose. I can't sleep on my shoulders, my bed's full of boulders, I feel like a last summer's rose." Singing together reinforced a sense of community, and when verses included such silly refrains, the young and old, student and professional, were united in playfulness. Adams enjoyed the campfire theatricals, even authoring and acting in some of the most memorable and outrageous ones. During the summer outing of 1931, which we're seeing here in the image, he wrote a mock Greek tragedy called Exhaustos, in which King Dihydros spars with his archenemy, Chryspos of Pucha, while the traitorous Princess Clytemnestra aids her father's nemesis. During the first act, the narrator, played by Adams himself and christened the spirit of the itinerary, proclaims, quote, "From 4 in the morning till 10 every night, the life of Dihydros is devoid of delight. Chryspos is threatening, the queen gives abuse, his daughter's a traitor, his son's of no use. Oh, hard is the life of Dihydros the mighty, among other things, he's forgotten his nighty," end quote. Adams engaged in word games. The king's mule Pegasus was last seen headed towards Modestos, a pun on the Central California valley town of Modesto, and wove in references to the Sierra Club. Chryspos' army was detected among the willows by the flash of cup and spoon, items the Sierra Club members carried like badges of honor, all while creating an engaging plot. Members of the outing party performed the play, with Adams as spirit of the itinerary, holding aloft a harp of bent wood and fishing line. Half a century later, when describing the play and its sequels, The Trudgeon Women The Oxides, and the unfinished The Mules by O Rest Your Fannies, he remarked, quote, "How funny these plays were in situ and how dismal when given anywhere else," end quote. This self-deprecating jab captures the essential quality of the outing's social life and entertainment. His play was funny because its audience members had so much in common: worldviews, values, the actor experiences, and friends. Their time together gave the inside jokes greater resonance. The actors' performances seemed stellar because they were carried out by friends, and the rustic condition heightened one's appreciation of the improvised production. This tight-knit group meant a great deal to his social life, and Adams's ambitions as a photographer grew. The Sierra Club members would become one of his core audiences. In some years, he photographed costumed actors from the annual productions to include in the outing albums. These images, though small in number, reflect his appreciation of this vital aspect of the summer treks. So that gives you a sense of those early days of the Sierra Club. So another big project that he did that links him very closely to California was working as a commercial photographer for the Yosemite Park and Curry Company. The Yosemite Park and Curry Company was the major concession in Yosemite Valley. So they provided lodging, they were the restaurants, and then they provided activities like the skating rink or skiing, or there was a toboggan slide. And so they were responsible for all of those things. Adams worked for Yosemite Park and Curry Company for about 8 years, and during that time reported to the marketing department of the YPCCO, is what Yosemite Park Curry Company was called. And it's important for 2 reasons. One is that in terms of California, he is responsible for marketing Yosemite Valley and the attractions there to a national audience to draw more vacationers to Yosemite. So he's in this role of booster of Yosemite. But in terms of his professional progression and his art career, it teaches him how to make really direct, straightforward, clear photographs that convey a message to a particular audience. And that's something that we see recurring in his mature work in the years that follow this particular job. So in the book, I focus on, in my chapter, this particular publication called The 4 Seasons in Yosemite National Park. It was a tourist publication sold in the park at the various concessions. And it was designed to encourage vacationers to come back in other seasons. Yosemite Park and Curry Company was trying to expand the number of visitors coming in the winter so that they could take advantage of that tourist dollar year-round. So here we're seeing Adams's picture of golfing in Yosemite. His pictures were used not only in that book, but in lots of other ways to promote Yosemite Valley. So for instance, this is what's called a window display. So in department store windows, his pictures were used in the back as part of a larger campaign to promote tourism to Yosemite. His images were also used on the cover of Ahwahnee restaurant menus. So here we're seeing the May 10th, 1936 breakfast menu. Each diner got their own personalized copy of the menu that they could take home as a souvenir. And Adams's images were the cover of those menus. He also produced images that were sent to newspapers for news stories that were also meant to promote Yosemite Valley. So here we're seeing the July 3rd, 1932 Rotogravure section of the San Francisco Chronicle. And ostensibly, this is a story about the heavy winter snows resulting in very strong waterfalls in Yosemite. But essentially, it's another way of promoting vacationing in Yosemite Valley. And so there's all this range of pictures of the waterfalls by Ansel Adams. And then there were also postcards. So here I'm showing this comparison. You can see the image in the upper right corner of Bridal Veil Falls in the newspaper. Adams repurposes for a postcard, a real photo postcard that he then sells in Best Studios in Yosemite as another way to promote the park. So all of this combines together to help inform the way that he will make his artwork more communicative and more clear in future years. So a good example of that is this picture, the Tetons and the Snake River, which is part of what he makes during a commission from the federal government beginning in 1941. So the last chapter of the book focuses on that body of work that he does. He's hired by the Department of the Interior, Harold Ickes is the Secretary of Interior, to make photographs of the national parks to be printed as murals to decorate the new Department of Interior building. And initially Adams is hired to do one mural, but he loves this commission and talks Harold Ickes into expanding the job and letting him drive all over the Western United States to make photographs for this project. And this is where we really begin to see his mature work consistently appearing. And this picture is a really great example. It shows a lot of those mature characteristics coming through. So the purpose of his mature work, much of it, is to persuade his audience of the importance and the value of the wilderness and of the natural world, to inspire these experiences like the transcendental one that I read to you about early in his life. So he does that by using certain characteristics. One of them is the panoramic sweep of the landscape that we see here. Another is an omniscient viewpoint, meaning that he chooses a perspective that gives a God's eye view of the scene and makes it seem like it's the only way to photograph this particular location. He also uses light and weather effects. So here we've got this amazing storm cloud over the mountains and the light filtering through. And he uses a wide range of gray tones. And that idea of the zone system is really important. And I go into that in greater depth in the book. But he uses all of those features to create drama and awe to make the pictures more persuasive. So for the last part here, last few minutes, what I'd like to do is read about another picture also made during that project of photographing the national parks in the Western United States. But it actually isn't a national park. It's Adams's moonrise picture. So I'm going to read this and then we'll move on to questions. Oft told, the story of its making is one of photographic legend. The creation of the moonrise negative happened on a trip when he was accompanied by his son Michael and his friend Cedric Wright. And that's what we're seeing in this photograph. So that's Michael sitting all the way to the left. Cedric Wright is in the middle, and that's Ansel Adams standing to the right. And this is them in Yosemite packing the car with all the supplies as they're getting ready to go on this trip in the fall of 1941. They had been making photographs without much success in the Chama River Valley near Georgia O'Keeffe's Ghost Ranch in northern New Mexico. Driving back to Santa Fe, Adams hastily responded to what he saw before him, quote, "In the east, the moon was rising over distant clouds and snow peaks, and in the west, the late afternoon sun glanced over a south-flowing cloud bank and blazed a brilliant white upon the crosses in the church cemetery," end quote. With the sun setting, he knew he had to act fast. Swerving his station wagon to the side of the road, he commanded his son and Wright to help him set up his 8x10-inch view camera. Tripod, camera body, lens board, lens, dart cloth, loaded film holder, and light meter had to be pulled out and assembled before he could frame and focus the view, made all the more urgent by the rapid descent of the November sun. In the frantic hustle, the light meter could not be found. Evaluating the scene before him, Adams miraculously remembered the luminance of the full moon, 250 candles per square foot, and was able to approximate an exposure for the scene. He released the shutter and captured the clouds, moon, and mountains beyond the little town of Hernandez. Before he could make a second backup negative, the sun dipped below the horizon and the opportunity was gone. With that single negative, Adams preserved a view that has become a photographic icon. The image at its core exhibits many of his mature stylistic elements. Adams filled the frame with a vast expanse of sky, the moon hovering above a bank of horizontally striated clouds and a long, low chain of mountains. He placed the chapel and cross-filled graveyard of Hernandez in the middle ground, bounded by a shrub-filled plain. The picture features a panoramic sweep of landscape and compellingly asserts that this perspective, with its precise arrangement of human edifice within a monumental and impressive environment, is the critical viewpoint for observing the scene. The drama comes in part from the relative scale of the elements. The endless quality of the sky reminds viewers how small and seemingly insignificant we are in the expanse of the universe. All of these visual qualities serve to inspire in the viewer a sense of awe in the face of a spectacular and visual experience, an appreciation for the natural scene, and a feeling of amazement. Unlike the mountain pictures of the late 1920s and 30s, found in his Parmelian prints portfolio or his Sierra Club album, Moonrise clearly conveys Adams's intensity of experience, his message about the transcendental possibilities for people when they are immersed in nature, and his deep appreciation for the American landscape. This slide compares his final print to his proof print. The proof print is a straight or unaltered printing from the negative with no darkroom work, such as dodging or burning, that allows the manipulation of exposure to select areas of a print. As such, it affords a view of Hernandez that is much closer to the one Adams originally observed, albeit in black and white. From this view of the landscape, he envisioned, or to use his parlance, visualized, the finished artwork of Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. Moonrise existed only in his imagination. He photographed a raw scene that he could transform in the darkroom into a symbol that would convey how he felt under a vast and beautiful New Mexico sky. By altering the relationship of the sky and the graveyard of the Hernandez Chapel to create a dark expanse over a shimmering village burial ground, Adams created from the raw material of the landscape an emotionally engaging image, one that borders on magic or mysticism. On that November day, Adams drew on more than 2 decades of wilderness exploration and photographic experience to create what would become his masterpiece. Deep and repeated contemplation had etched in him the value and meaning of immersing oneself in nature. Equally ingrained were lessons about making photographs that effectively convey an essential idea. Adams's early years had readied him for the scene he discovered along the highway as the sun set over northern New Mexico. Thank you. So I'd be happy to take any questions if people have them.
Thanks so much, Becky, for that. Moonrise existed only in his imagination. I just love that line. It's just so great. So we had a couple of questions that Paula and I will sort of give them to you. The first one that I wanted to ask, but first before I mention it, the photograph that you showed of Exhaustus, the play that they put on in the forest, which is such a hilarious and wonderful picture. Our very own Michael Dawson, board member and photographic sage, his aunt and cousin are in that picture, which I think is just a hilarious coincidence. But about that picture, we have a question from David Solo, who says, Is the text of Exhaustus published anywhere, online or in print?
That's an excellent question. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that I've seen the full manuscript in the Ansel Adams archive, and I believe that that is what I was quoting from. I'm not aware that it is, but I'm happy to look. I'll email you all after because I can look at my footnotes and see where I quote it from.
Oh, thank you. We're plotting a remount.
Yeah, I think the whole point is that we all have to go camp together for
Yeah.
2 weeks and then put it on, and then it's going to seem really phenomenal.
Yeah. Yes. And Paul Kopikin made a remark. It's kind of shocking to imagine a time when they were wanting more people in Yosemite, because now it's just such a crowded, well, not now, but
Right.
last year.
Yeah, no, I mean, John Muir really believed that as long as there was a tiny segment of the population that was using and appreciating the wilderness, that it was in danger. Because if most of the world was living in cities or on farms and never was availing themselves of the experience of being in the wilderness, then when logging companies came along, or later oil companies came along, people wouldn't have any idea why you might want to preserve that space. And so for him, it was really critical that you connected individuals to the experience of those places, that they, and he had a particular approach that I talk about, that is about understanding the geology. You want to understand granite and the formation of the valley and the formation of the domes. You want to appreciate what kinds of trees grow there and why they can grow there. That kind of very intellectualized understanding gives you a deeper attachment and appreciation. And we see Adams really embrace that. So he has maps, and he knows the peaks and where they are in relation to each other, and the altitudes, and the plants, and the animals, and the birds, so it's a really particular way of learning and experiencing the wilderness. But it's pretty typical to us now. In 1902, there was no such thing as hiking. I mean, that wasn't a thing people did. So Adams is coming of age as this hobby is coming of age. And so his track as an environmentalist is right along with a new way of understanding the idea of wilderness. And I could go on about Yosemite too, because Adams is involved with the Park Service and thinking about planning for the parks specifically as well. But I'll let you ask other questions. It's you guys, it's super dangerous to take somebody who wrote their doctoral dissertation and then give them a platform to talk about it. Like I've often said that if they needed somebody to deal with a filibuster, like they could just put me on the floor of Congress and I could talk about Ansel Adams for several days without stopping. So anyway, I love to talk about it.
You could do that here and everyone would be very happy.
Well,
we have one question that comes from Douglas Marshall, and he says, was young Ansel aware or inspired by the views of Yosemite by Carlton Watkins?
So Adams, one of the things to know about Adams is that he was always very aware of his forebears. So he definitely knew about Watkins and Muybridge, but he actually was most attracted to the work of George Fiske, who we don't know as much about, whose reputation isn't as storied as either Watkins or Muybridge. What Adams appreciated about Fiske was that Fiske lived in the valley. He actually had a studio right in Yosemite Valley. And Fiske lived and photographed Yosemite much more like Adams lived and photographed Yosemite. So because he was there, Fiske, year round, he was able to photograph it when the waterfalls were the strongest, when the light was the best, when the clouds were the best, when the snow was the deepest. And he felt that Fiske really understood it, whereas both Muybridge and Watkins were visitors to Yosemite. They would kind of drop in and make pictures. And so they photographed in many of the most sort of, forgive me, the most obvious spots, the places where the major views were. But Adams really appreciated Fisk's more subtle approach to the nuances of the place.
So I have a question coming in here. I'm really glad this question came in because it's from Anne Breckenridge-Barrett, who is the director of the CCP. And I forgot to welcome her in the beginning because I knew she was here. And she's asked this very good question, which is, she says, "Hi, Becky, why did Adams tend to talk less about his early work? Was he dismissive of it?"
Yeah, so Adams, because he became famous towards the end of his life and had a whole group of people around him in those later years, including Bill Turnage and Mary Allender and Andrea Stillman, he was really focused on the work that begins with the period that starts with like Tetons and Snake River and Moonrise. Those are both in 1941. That's when his mature work is established. So we begin to see him at that point forward using those characteristics that I described. And to him, that was his body of work. There were a few examples that predate that fit with his mature work, but as a rule, he felt that the earlier work was immature. It didn't yet rise to the standard of most of his work. So he was dismissive of it. And what's interesting is because he was dismissive and he would tell people like Turnage and Stillman and Allender that it wasn't important, and they were so close to him, they followed suit. So when those people wrote books or talked about Adams, they talked about the mature work. And by the time I came along, Adams was gone, and I was coming at it from a scholarly place. And it just seemed, well, first of all, remarkable that he started in such a different style than he becomes famous for. The early work wasn't studied, so as a scholar, that gave me an opening to do something that people hadn't done. But I just couldn't believe that it didn't matter. And so what I was able to do with the book was show how Adams learned from those early experiences and incorporated the knowledge from those experiences into the next thing, and really teaches himself how to become the photographer that is so famous. So he was not born with genius that just exhibited itself. He taught himself how to be that photographer and how to be successful and how to make the pictures that resonated with people on purpose. This wasn't an accident. And so that's what this book does. Looks at that early work and shows him charting a particular course.
There are a couple other questions in the Q&A box over here. We've got two zones going. And we have a question about the Parmelian portfolio and how many prints and the size of those. That comes from Joe Doherty.
So the Parmelian prints, it's a portfolio of 18 images, and I don't know the size off the top of my head, but the sheets must be, I don't know, 12 by 14, and the images are probably not larger than 5 by 7. So they're small, although not small for that moment. It's published in 1927, and part of the thinking behind calling them Parmelian prints is that Adams is trying to align this product that he's got with other products that arts patrons are buying. So the notion of calling it a portfolio of prints is a way to align it with portfolios of engravings or etchings or photogravures. And so the packaging of it is also similar to the way a person might have bought a portfolio of prints in that era.
A marketing decision.
Exactly.
Yeah. I have another one, Michael. Do you have another one?
I have another one, but you go first.
Okay. Michael Dawson is asking if there's a CCP connection with any archival holdings of George Fisk. And he adds that he knows Terence Pitts wrote the introduction to the only monograph.
Right. So I don't believe we have archival, I believe the only archival materials we have are in the Ansel Adams archive. So Adams owned some Fisk negatives, and I believe in the center's collection we have Adams prints from those Fisk negatives. I'm not aware that there are other Fisk archive materials, but that's another one I can look up. I'm starting a list. So
I have one here from Grant McMillan, and he asked, is there a record of why and how Ansel Adams made his post-processing decisions?
Oh, yes, there's loads of information there. So Adams was such an educator at heart. He really deeply believed in proselytizing about the value of photography as a medium. He wanted as many people as possible to participate in it. And so he wrote all kinds of instructional manuals. And so there was a series that included the negative, the darkroom, the print. And so in that book, The Print, you can read a lot about his technical instruction about post-processing. He also did a book at the very end of his life called Examples, The Making of 40 Photographs, where he literally goes through 40 different of his famous photographs and talks about the making of that picture. And sometimes he focuses on the circumstances or where he made the picture or why he made the picture. He includes a portrait of Stieglitz and a portrait of O'Keeffe and talks about his relationships to those people. But in many instances, again, he will talk about the challenges of printing a particular picture or how he worked with it in the darkroom. And then in the archive, we have printing notes. So for many of the pictures that he's working on later in his life, he has annotations of the individual steps that he would take in the darkroom. And it's almost like it's like a book map, if anybody has seen a book map, with little frames. And then each frame he draws whether he dodged or burned and for how long. So I wish I had an example here, but because we have the printing instructions for Moonrise. So, there'll be these little swirly marks that show him dodging around the edges, or a little circle with a +5, which means he burned that area for 5 seconds. So he actually kept notes so that he could go back and print again and approximate the steps that he had taken previously.
Wow.
Yeah.
We have one question that's coming from Beth Rothman, and this is about what are your thoughts on the book Taos that he did?
So one of the chapters in my book is about Taos, but since Taos isn't in California, I didn't talk about it in today's talk. But it's a really important book, and it's actually important to my argument because Parmelian Prints, which is his first professional outing, doesn't sell particularly well. My feeling is that not knowing who the audience was and not really understanding how to package something for a patron, he didn't know what to do. So he put out pictures that he had been making for himself, but that don't really communicate particularly well. With Taos, by that point, Taos is 1930. So just 3 years later, but in the intervening years, he's joined a number of book collecting clubs in the Bay Area. And by associating with high-end book collectors, he realizes that there are certain criteria that book collectors are interested in. So they want rarity, they want luxurious materials, they want not just rarity, but unique approaches to bookmaking, because that will make that particular book a special example within their collection. So with Taos, Adams sets out to make a book that is irresistible to this group of high-end book collectors. And by what he decides to do, he works with Mary Austin, who's a novelist and Indian activist, and she writes the text about Taos Pueblo. He makes 12 photographs. And what they do is they send the paper for the book
the same paper that they print the letterpress text on, to William Dassenville, who hand coats the pages, and then Adams hand prints in the darkroom all of the images for the bound book. So when you buy an original Taos Pueblo book, those are Ansel Adams darkroom photographs bound into the book. It was incredibly laborious and expensive to do, and it remains a very rare example of that approach to bookmaking. And I mean, it's great for my argument because it shows Adams here has clicked in on what it means to have an audience, to know who they are, to create a product especially for them, and he just knocks it out of the park. The book was I can't remember the price, $100, but in today's dollars, it's like $1,100. He's selling it in December of 1930, so we're in the Great Depression, and he sells the entire edition out. So it was like he figured out how to make a product that would sell. And so just between 1927, when he does Carmelian prints and doesn't know how to do that, and 1930, we see him learning how to identify and market to an audience.
Great. So that we have another couple of questions, but and we'll sort of try to wrap up because we're coming towards the end. But there's this one comes from Greg, and he says, do you discuss the group F-64 in your book, and what was Adams' relationship with Edward Weston like?
So I mention it only passingly. There's lots of great writing, including by Mary Allender, about Group F-64. Ansel Adams and Edward Weston had a very sweet and very close relationship. Adams had tremendous respect for Edward Weston, and I think it was mutual. There's correspondence between the two of them where you see Edward Weston writing to Ansel Adams and saying, what was that formula for developer that you had? You had some great thing and I'm trying to recreate it, and can you tell me about what that was? In Weston's later years, as he was ailing, Adams was really trying to help him. He and Virginia published a book of Weston's work as an attempt to try and get him some financial support. Adams, I think, was always a little perplexed by Weston's how introverted he was, and how he was not that invested in making his photographs widely and publicly available, which to Adams was so important. Adams was a communicator, and so the more people who saw his work, the better. And that just wasn't the thing that motivated Edward Weston. So they were very different men, but I think they really cared for each other quite a lot, and had this relationship of mutual respect. I would recommend, there's such good material about Group F-64. It was this shining, exciting moment in 1932 when the DeYoung Museum saw what was happening in photography on the West Coast and wanted to create a platform for that, which it's interesting to note he ultimately got fired for. Lloyd Rollins, the head of the DeYoung, who created the Group F-64 exhibition. It was not everybody thought photography belonged to museums at that moment, but we have, at the center, we have the Edward Weston Archive as well. And in that Group F-64 exhibition, all of the prints were for sale, and the prints were marked. And I think everyone's photographs were sold for $15, except for Edward Weston, who had the most established career at the time, and his pictures sold for $25 a piece. And this is the crazy part, we have one of the prints that was in that Group F-64 show in the Edward Weston Archive with the 25 marked on the back, still in the archive because it didn't sell.
That's great. Hey, I have one, just a little circle back question.
Sure.
Someone, or Doug Bush asked about the Taos book you were just talking about a few minutes ago. He asked, how big was the edition of that book?
I think it was 108.
Okay.
And although I did for my dissertation, but not in this book, I did a census, meaning I tried to track down every single copy of it. And the numbering's a little wonky. So like I'd be keeping track and I would say, okay, book number 37 is in this collection. And then I would find a second book number 37 in a different collection. So they were hand numbered. And so it's a little, I don't know if that means there are extra books or if there are 2 37s and no 39, because I haven't found every single copy yet. But I think the edition was 108. And then there in the 1970s, and maybe it's actually 1970, Michael would know, Michael Dawson, there was a facsimile edition of it printed. And so those are around as well, but those aren't original photographs. That's a facsimile.
Beth Rothman, who asked the original question, said, we have 2 of the books, which is kind of in the chat.
Good to know. If she'd be willing to share that with me, I'll put it into my census because I am trying to keep track of all of the copies. It's really helpful in researching to understand where they ended up and track back the provenance to understand who they got sold to originally.
So I want to just end with this final question about Ansel Adams was hugely influential in establishing the Center for Creative Photography in Arizona. I just wonder if you could talk for a couple seconds about that.
Sure. Yeah, so Ansel Adams, all his life was interested in establishing a place for photography. And it really goes back to his visit to Alfred Stieglitz in 1933. His wife was pregnant with their son, Michael, many of whom I'm sure you know. And Adams's father said, if you don't go to New York now, I don't know when you're going to have a chance to go. So Ansel and Virginia went to New York City and met Stieglitz. And Adams was so blown away by the idea of this gallery in American Place and Stieglitz there at the helm as a hallowed ground for photography, a place dedicated to the medium that he loved. And so he came home and opened his own gallery. It was only open for 9 months in San Francisco, but he wanted a similar place on the West Coast. And throughout his life, he built institutions. So he helped found the photography department at the Museum of Modern Art in 1940. Of course, many of you will be familiar with Friends of Photography, which he founded as another photography institution. But I think the center was really his most effective creation of a place for photography. And he co-founded it with the University of Arizona president, John Schaefer, then president. And John Schaefer in '74 had invited Adams to have a show at the University of Arizona. And Dr. Schaefer always jokes, he says, I was so young and so naive that I just walked up to Ansel Adams and asked him if he would give his archive to the University of Arizona, and not realizing that like you're supposed to wine and dine somebody for a decade before you ask them something like that. But Adams, who was a very straight shooter, good Western man, said, well, you know, I'd kind of been talking to the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley about my archive, but they're interested in me as an environmentalist. If you want to put me in a context of photography, then I would be interested in that, and we should discuss that. And so in December of 1974, Dr. Schaefer spends a week with Ansel Adams at his home in Carmel, and they basically conceptualize the Center for Creative Photography. And Adams reached out to his friend Beaumont Newhall and said, we're thinking about this idea of creating an archive for photography. It's notable, in 1975, there was not an institution in the US collecting the archives of living photographers. So the center was the first institution to be collecting the work of, or archives of living photographers. And Beaumont Newhall said, you should talk to Harold Jones, who's the director of Light Gallery in New York City. He's got all of these great artists who are represented by the gallery. And so Adams did talk to Harold, and Harold brought Harry Callahan, Aaron Siskind, and Frederick Sommer into the CCP as 3 of the 5 original archives. And then Adams's friend Wynn Bullock was the 5th. So In December of 1974, they came up with the idea. In May of 1975, they founded the CCP with those 5 archives.
Wow, that's,
The rest is history.
I'll say, yeah. So Becky, I wanted to just, this wonderful comment just came in at the very end. It says, it's from Susan Hawkins. And she says, thanks so much, Becky. We would be happy to listen to your talk about Ansel Adams as long as you want. It brings back wonderful memories of time spent with him. By the way, I think the image of him in front of the mural poster was taken in my gallery at Ansel's retirement exhibition in 1975, December.
Oh, that's so lovely.
In front of the picture.
Oh,
Anyway,
that's great.
I love these connections when they come through. So I want to thank you for coming and for spending so much time with us. It was just wonderful to listen to your story about your book and hear the readings from it. And I want to let everybody know that in the chat, there's a link to Arcana Books that has the book for sale. It would be great if you could all buy it because it's a fantastic book. It belongs in everybody's book collection. And it's called Making a Photographer, the Early Work of Ansel Adams by Rebecca Senf. And this is great. Thanks so much for coming.
It looks like this.
It looks like that.
Uh-huh. And I hope that when we get to the after times that we can have a book signing and a little party, and I can be with you all in person, because it's lovely to have this opportunity since we can't be in person, but I miss you all.
Yeah, we miss you terribly. And yeah, and also I was saying we see each other at photo fairs, and I went, oh, photo fairs. I wish I could go to a photo fair. Anyway, we'll definitely see each other. This is going to be over, and we're going to see each other all again here in Los Angeles or around the world. Thank you so much. And for our listeners or observers who are not PAC members, please come to paclosangeles.com and become a member, and you won't get a talk as good as this. No, there's lots of great talks. I swear, this is a whole new era for us because we've been able to do some wonderful talks so far, and we're just building it out, and it's gonna be a fun time. Thank you, Becky.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And thanks, Paula. And we'll see
Getting
you
a
all.
lot of thank yous in the chat. A lot of
Thank yous.
yes,
Very
Thank you
nice.
so much. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Have a good weekend.